Okay, so today we're going to be looking at chapter 6. Starting off, there's this old out-of-print book that I was able to find a copy of that has on Minnesota history, and we'll be reading some passages from it when we get more into like early settlers and stuff. But I had some interesting historical photos that I have not been able to kind of find in other places. But they're scans, so that's why they look like they're scans out of a book. But a lot of early Minnesota history, a lot of early maps that, as you could tell, are like not very accurate in lots of ways. I think that one we might have seen in something else. Fort Snelling. The early days of Fort Snelling. These being drawings, a lot of them are not super great or super detailed. Wild rice harvesting, right, that we just saw some of. Next amount of detail. Through time, of course, the maps get a bit more accurate, right? This is actually an immigrant couple we're going to read more specifically of next week, just through their photo in there. And we'll, like I said, we'll be talking more about immigration. And this book has lots of the old ads. There was like a big effort to try to get people to move up to Minnesota. Early Minneapolis. Right, slightly more accurate map. Some early housing, 1850s, which is still kind of the time frame we're talking about. I think this picture was used a lot actually in the documentary that we watched.
That was for like the treaty, to my knowledge, right? That was like that was like for the peace treaty or whatever it was, right? To give up land.
Exactly, yeah. Yes, and they were made to sit for this photo, basically like, yes, we're taking your land. St. Anthony Falls, which again, this chapter is all about lumber and the lumber industry, and that's, you can see some lumber in it. This is where a lot of the lumber was brought down to. This is one of the announcements of Civil War. All right, so lumbering, the chapter calls it the first great industry in Minnesota. And I'm just gonna leave this stuff up here just to make me look smart. Not from this class, so don't worry about writing this down. But the lumber industry, taxes from it, local taxes from the lumber industry, since it was the first great industry, meaning the first really big industry, made a good amount of money, so a lot of the money went into things that we built up here. These are just me trying to take pictures of some of the pictures from the textbook, with mixed amount of success and how well I was able to scan these. So let's see, in the early days, white pine was one of the main types of tree that was cut. It was just kind of like an ideal magic type of tree, odorless, floated on the water, very light, slow to decay, so you can cut it and kind of take your time transporting it. A lot of these trees, it's kind of interesting actually, because we've talked before about how much of Minnesota was already being farmed by Native Americans right before settlers came in. When there was if you study kind of older history, you'll know that, Europeans introduced a lot of diseases into the Native American population, and all of the Americas, a very large percentage, died off. So a lot of the trees that came about were specifically in lots of land that actually had been farmed, but they grew over, just like, any area, if you just kind of let it be, plants and animals and whatnot will come back. So a lot of these trees were specifically the age of that great amount of people dying off from disease. Through time, the white pine, was replaced by European weaker strains, just because they grew a little quicker, and we're trying to get the supply back up because it's tough to rapidly replace trees that are 250 years of growth in them, right? Map of sawmills. As you can imagine, these are highly correlated with rivers and streams, right? Because that is how logs were conveyed for a good amount of time, as well as how they're chopped up. The energy to chop them up is from that moving water. I just Googled some pictures of white pine. I would say, still see, well, I feel like I see white pine here and there, usually kind of older forested areas. I just did some internet searching for photos of lumberjacks from the time frame we're looking at. Cook shack, sleep camp, is, you know, kind of like bunks. Blacksmith shop, stables, not great images, but better than nothing. Filer shop and office / store. These were, when we see the little maps of the different kind of camps, the lumber camps, these are kind of just a number of the traditional things that go on there, right? So these saws need to be kept in shape. You need to have equipment to keep them sharp, keep everything kind of working and functional. Well, like I said, a lot of these mills used running water increasingly through time because there was so much excess wood, because when you bring in those logs, well, you're cutting off all the bark and stuff, right? Well, those scraps are really good for burning. And we've read a number of different examples of why they, often if these scraps were just left out where the trees were cut down, they'd be a great big fire hazard. The diet of the lumbermen. Like I said, some of those things that I looked up, you can see this is a picture from our book. So you can see how those kind of correlate. Didn't have any pictures of the outhouse, I guess, but not of the rest. Again, pictures from the book. Bunk houses looked like. So the lumber industry and the people who did it, like, they had lots of specific little parts that they played. You know, there were people who were just the ones who would stamp and mark the logs, right? There are people who would just do the specific things. And these rafts of logs, I've shown some pictures before. Oh, that's terrible. But they're gigantic amount of wood, right? Just like difficult to fathom. Did you see something?
No.
Oh, okay. Sorry. And you know, one of the problems with using streams and rivers as opposed to vehicles to carry them is they, well, if you wanted to have any other use of that body of water for like a boat and moving people, it's like, well, good luck, because this is what we got going on. So many of our early towns, the reason they exist is because, well, they were where these logs could go. They had the moving water for some power, and because they had that power and an amount of construction was done just for the lumber industry, that was kind of like the anchor or the center of further development that would happen later, right? Staying at the Falls being the kind of main big example of why Minneapolis is where it is. So lots of building material home offices are still located in the state, even if they're national companies, because again, that connection with some of these original things. A couple more pictures of specifically St. Anthony Falls. Well, pictures, this is with a drawing. Quite a bit of the stuff that I was trying to look up, trying to find photos from the time frame, well, there's more drawings, because drawings were actually cheaper and easier than photography back then. Like, especially if you want something that's in color, it's going to have to be a drawing. So I'm hoping it's an amount correct. And I also found this specific little schematic here. Well, this is of course later on that it was switched to power. But in a nutshell, this running water, right, it moves gears, and these gears, well, you guys maybe if some of you know electricity generation, right? If you have some wires, you have a magnet, and have these moving around, creates a current, and so you could have electricity. Again, a big part of the reason why Minneapolis is where it is. Well, through time, as you can imagine, lots of the places where lumber existed that was right next to rivers and streams, that was the stuff that was cut first, right? Because it was easiest to get to. So through time, when the railroad started taking over, that started to be utilized for lumber as well, and the railroad was able to go to places that streams and river did not go. And in fact, the map of a lot of the rail lines are specifically very different than a map of bodies of water, because it was to go to those other places. It didn't take too long before those places started to become depleted too. So when I looked up some pictures from the age of the changeover from, well, having logs going down the stream, and again, look at that picture of Taylor's Falls. Actually, anybody ever go hiking over at Taylor's Falls? A number of people. It's a really nice little area. Doesn't really look like this anymore, but next time you're hiking there.
I can't fathom that. That's a lot of logs.
I mean, the state was covered in woods, you know. Well, and then switched to this, right? Much more, well, allows the river to have other uses. So this came from the book, so it's obviously more modern. Excuse me. Book talks about Paul Bunyan a bit. People have probably heard of Paul Bunyan if you're from Minnesota. I read a couple different Paul Bunyan tall tales. Was deciding if they were worth bringing to class, and I was like, let's see. Well, one of the interesting things about Paul Bunyan, you know, being this really large, huge. I think I got a couple of pictures of some state representations of him. But in lots of ways, well, different cities, if a bunch of lumberjacks would be staying in a city for a while instead of kind of out toward the woods, if they weren't in their camp and they would come to your local town, they're kind of known for tearing things up, or just like destroying things and making messes and stuff. And so that's part of how this type of legend came about, of like, well, they're these great big giants, and so of course they destroy everything when they walk. They can't help it, they're just big, you know. As I said, the book talks about the changeover to more modern, more sustainable methods of lumber. Let's see, what else can I say here? One thing that isn't kind of commonly known is many in the lumber industry, they were not necessarily locals who were Minnesotans who were here. They just came in as the wood was depleted in neighboring states, as those states would be cut down. And sure enough, as soon as our forests were cut down, they most just went to other states again, often directly to Michigan, because it was just kind of like the next state that hadn't been cut down very much. And you know, we still use wood products for lots of different things, but through time, you know, we switched to cement, switched to structural steel, because we just didn't have, especially the giant logs anymore. Sometimes, I don't know if you guys have been to like an older building and seen kind of the huge tree foundations of some of the structures and whatnot. Just not something feasible. Like I said, we just can't grow 250-year-old wood faster than 250 years, so can't really get these giant things so much. the last log to go down St. Anthony, 1919. So that's the kind of phase out of the lumber industry locally. We talked about actually some of this before already, that, well, a lot of the land that was lumbered was done without permission, without paying the people who owned the land. Sometimes there was fraudulent property deeds that were signed over. Sometimes it was just literally sneaking out in the night and chopping down some woods and sneaking them back. They'd be caught sometimes too, and just like it was just rampant fraud. And I think the local governments really didn't care that much. They really wanted, conceptually and culturally, Minnesota was very much in the mind frame of that this was a wild wilderness that needed to be tamed, that these areas that were wild forests needed to be chopped down and leveled and made into very productive farms. And when I say productive farms, well, the Native Americans who were farming in Minnesota, it was subsistence level farming, if you ever heard that term in a class or anything. Subsistence meaning you're farming enough for yourself and for your family and maybe a small community, but you're not like maximizing that farm so you could sell as much as possible to get as much income as possible, right? That was more of the European method and the early American method. So that switchover happened. Although plenty, like I said, it was culturally, it was seen that, you know, this is wild land that needs to be tamed. We need to chop down these trees and replace them all with these super productive farms. But much of the land, you know, a forest in Minnesota, similar to like if you go to the tropics and you go to a forest, it's a rich mosaic and ecosystem of all kinds of plants and animals that are all basically different parts of a big puzzle. And land, if you're just monoculture, so you're gonna plant just corn, well, for that to actually work, yeah, you can't have a big ecosystem supporting it. Then you need to have herbicides and pesticides and fertilizers, and you got to do all kinds of other stuff to make up for what's missing. So a lot of that farmland. Sometimes you could even farm it for like a couple seasons, maybe a few years, but without very expensive additions to that farming land, which a lot of new immigrants just did not have. Many of them spent everything they had on this lot of land that they would get that they were told was this wonderful, pristine Minnesota farmland. And there was land that was like that, of course, but that tended to go for more money and tended to get traded up to larger scale agribusiness. That, of course, as we know in our day and age now, that's kind of mostly farming is mostly the huge agribusinesses. Let's see. A couple of really big fires. I think the Hinckley one was mentioned in one of the videos that we showed. I might show a video later that goes into more detail about that. The book also talks a bit about clear cutting. There was a lot more clear cutting. Images isn't great, but these are the ones I could find out for Minnesota and clear cutting. Clear cutting is just when you just cut it all down, right? It's a lot of forestry these days. It's more piecemeal. You'll have a bunch of woods growing and you'll go out and cut one from here and there because clear cutting, it has some problems to it, which is very often the land itself will be held together by the roots of those trees. And so when you clear cut, even if you don't take the stumps out, many of the roots will just die off. And then all this thing that structurally held your landscape together, you could have big mudslides, you could have, at best, a lot of soil erosion because the rain will just kind of strip off all the topsoil and stuff. But clear cutting is how most of it was done because there wasn't really, the lumberjacks, they weren't here for the long haul. They didn't really care what happened to the land after they cut down the trees. They were off to Michigan. Well, as I said, through time, a lot of the kind of better trees were cut. So the wood industry transitioned into things like paper products. They also had to switch to different breeds of tree that would grow quicker and that were better for the new products that they're trying to make, from paper to whatever smaller things made out of wood rather than the huge giant things made out of wood. A bunch of problems actually started coming about too, with a lot of new breeds of trees that were brought in. A lot of them weren't especially good breeds of trees, and very often they would suffer from all kinds of different tree diseases. I just did some Googling for some of the local trees. Modern day people who work in the wood industry or logging, it's a very different thing. Much of the work has been mechanized. Again, more historical photos. I didn't know the horses were that strong that they could carry that much stuff on a load like that. And this is just another lumberjack camp. Many of these lumberjack camps were not made to last, so many of them have degraded and fallen apart through time. If you go out to places, often what you'll see are recreations, but I was able to find some random photos. All right, well now, I'm gonna have you guys use some work in small groups. And to pick your groups, well, I'm gonna have you draw cards. So that way, you can meet some new people, experience some new ideas, just shuffling these cards a little bit. So I'll come out, and this will be kind of the normal thing. And I've given you guys a lot of extra time today just to make sure we can get through it all. I'll have you draw cards, and I'll put you together by suit.
If you want to scale those horses, there's people in the background that are probably fairly far away, and they are about the same size as those horses.
Oh, you think the horses were extra big?
Yeah,
Ah.
there's humongous breeds of horses.
Wouldn't surprise me if you were actually the same day.
Yeah. Have you ever seen like a Clydesdale and stuff? They're humongous.
About the size of your head. You're bigger, probably.
So the 5 and 6 for the test tonight, and then 6, it's 7 and 8 this week.
That's it.
I like the last one.
Alright,
It's not a question.
Alright, who has drawn a diamond? Who's drawn a diamond? Diamond, I'm looking for like a cluster. Or how about diamond in that back corner? You'll be one group. What about hearts? Who has hearts? Hearts. How about hearts just kind of over here-ish? Hearts over here-ish. What else do we have?
Clubs?
Clubs. Who has clubs? Okay, clubs over here-ish. Over here-ish, okay. So get in these groups, take your cards with you. I'll come collect them in a minute. And first thing you do when you get together, introduce yourself to everyone in your group, because hopefully you're working with some new people. And work through these questions on a piece of paper.
There's that, so you can grab all the cards.
You done it? All right.
So we only need.
I'll trade and you can have that chair.
What?
So it's
I'll
two
trade and
spots.
sit across.
I mean, it's
Okay, so you
per
jump.
town.
Okay.
That's
I'll sit right here. Let's sit right there. Perfect. Here, do you want to move right there?
Yeah.
And then I'll be across.
There's a chair right there. Thank you.
first thing that's not on there, put all your names, full names on a piece of paper, because these are for points today, right? So one piece of paper per group. One piece of paper per group.
We can pass around the room.
And feel free to use your books to answer these questions. You could pop open your book, chapter 6. Can I get your dining card? Also get your cards. Thank you.
Alright.
So, number one, try to think of at least two positive things about
You're provided the capital needed to develop like the frontier. Yeah, and like great town. Yeah. It was like one of the main buildings. Mill town.
several longers and then
Yeah.
Two negative things, I guess, deforestation.
Remember, I gotta write this down.
Sorry, well, there wasn't.
Two, what was the second one? What was the second positive?
Development. Yeah.
Or negative. It destroyed the ecosystem.
And also forest fires.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then, or we